Side 1 begins with Good Day Sunshine. Mainly written by Paul McCartney, this is definitely one of the more happier, if not the most optimistic song of the album. It's basically just this guy going along, just having a bit of fun with his love interest, just having fun in the outside world, taking in the sunshine, and it kind of feels like how in one of the previous songs I mentioned it's kind of about this person trying to get up from his bed, just trying to get his energy up. Good Day Sunshine kind of feels like a continuation of that. Just finally fully energized and just fully happy and bright and colorful, and it almost feels like a kind of like a prequel of some sorts to something like ELO's Mr. Blue Sky, what were being about bright skies and sunshine and all that. And though some people would say it's about drugs, but then again, they'll say any Beatles song is about drugs these days. The music itself is mostly dominated by the pianos, giving off this almost honky-tonk vaudeville kind of sound, or almost like it's trying to capture the sounds of like the 40s or the 50s. And there's even a bit of a piano solo overdubbed and performed by George Martin himself, who is considered by many to be the fifth Beatle, though even that is still up for debate. Regardless though, this is still a very happy, very uplifting, very joyful song. If you're in the mood for a happy song, like a feel-good yet old-school summer song to just listen to and just kind of feel kind of fulfilled and just kind of hopeful, this is the kind of song that I would recommend. And yeah. The next song, And Your Bird Can Sing, is another very simple yet very open to interpretation kind of song. This one's written mainly by John Lennon, and if you actually look into the lyrics, you can definitely tell it's by him. How he kind of deconstructs and kind of slams at the face of materialism, how you've got everything you want and your bird can sing, or your prized possessions will eventually weigh down on you. It's almost kind of like a foreshadow of what's to come with his most famous solo song, Imagine, and how he tells us to imagine a world without possessions. Just imagine a world where how love, as he reminds and stresses, is more important than just having a bunch of material stuff. Many other interpretations have said that this is more of a response or an answer to someone like Frank Sinatra or Mick Jagger, how they have everything how they're so famous and so fortunate that they're just given anything that they ever wanted, and John wrote this as a kind of answer to that. I'm not sure if this was ever confirmed by him or any of his fellow bandmates or producers or other associates, but I still think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, since Frank and Mick were very big around the 60s. As for the music itself in the song, it's mainly dominated by Paul and George Harrison kind of harmoniously playing their guitars together, on top of their already harmonious vocals, which is, to this day, is still kind of impressive, even by 1966. And something I forgot to mention is that apparently this whole album took nearly 11 weeks to record altogether. Yeah, 11 weeks to record this whole album. Mind you, it's still a very short album, like 35 minutes, but back then it was kind of sort of common, but still very tricky and ambitious. I think even nowadays, you would have to be big and talented to record, produce, finalize, and master a whole album worth of songs within like 2 or 3 months or so. That's what I call dedication and ambition. Then we have For No One. Much like Eleanor Rigby, this one's primarily written by Paul McCartney, and is a very minimalistic song with a somewhat melancholy theme to its lyrics. This time, instead of being dominated by strings such as violins and cellos, Paul McCartney plays mainly a clavichord, giving off a very waltz-like, chamberish kind of musical vibe, while Ringo Starr plays some of the maracas. The other half of the Beatles, Lennon and Harrison, had no involvement in this particular song whatsoever. Interesting what you think about it. This song was played by the two surviving Beatles, while the now deceased ones weren't involved in it. Something to think about. Plus, there is a French horn solo performed by a man named Alan Civil, which is a very, very good solo, and it helps emphasize that old kind of old time kind of feel to the song. In fact, he would go on to be part of the orchestra recorded for the Sgt. Pepper album, which is very good and talented. The lyrics themselves mostly deal with a kind of breakup, or at least the build up to a particular breakup. How there's no sign of love behind the tears of this woman that Paul McCartney sings about. And it does feel almost emotional away. People have considered this one of Paul McCartney's best songs, and of course, I fail to see I fail to see a bad reason. Despite the title may have you think, this is a song for anyone. Anyone can relate to this. Anyone who's had hardships in their lives, who had breakups in their relationships, it's practically for everyone. And much like And Your Bird Can Sing, this one also ends on a very offish chord, almost kind of representing a sense of uncertainty or indecisiveness, which I think kind of helps add to the overall concept of those songs. Well, anyway, we come to the next song, Dr. Robert. Now, this is one where I could definitely say is probably one of the few songs of theirs which is probably intentionally about drugs, at least in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way. John Lennon, who is the main writer for the song, goes on about this Dr. Robert character, who he says can offer a good time or a little sip of his special cup or something. No doubt an allegory for dealing with drugs and whatnot. There's also been speculation on who this Dr. Robert character is based on. Some have said that it was apparently Bob Dylan himself who introduced the Beatles to marijuana back in like 64, which is kind of funny seeing how Dylan and Harrison would be part of the Traveling Wilburys. The music itself, while not all out surreal as other songs, still has that slight subtle psychedelia to the vibe, mainly in its guitars. Even if it is a very simple, basic guitar riff, it still has that kind of surrealist vibe, which kind of helps emphasize the idea of it being about someone giving you a drug to help cope with your kind of psychosis or whatnot. So it's not exactly saying that drugs are good per se, nor is it saying that drugs are bad per se. It just talks about a guy who just offers you something just to make you feel good. It's essentially a Dr. Feel-Good kind of song. Then we come to I Want to Tell You. The third of three songs written by George Harrison. This one kind of delves into how often we have these ideas, these feelings and thoughts in our head, and yet the difficulty comes from just trying to express them properly into simplest of words, and how we can easily get fuddled and kind of confused or miscommunicated, really. And that kind of theme is emphasized in some of its music, particular with Harrison's guitars and the piano played by Paul McCartney, how they kind of stammer and kind of jolt a bit every now and then. This is another one of those songs that I think many people can very relate to, even autistic people like myself, and how we kind of bottle up our feelings and we just don't know how to express ourselves, or even if we actually understand ourselves, or if we can properly understand other people. It also kind of connects with the kind of loneliness that Eleanor Rigby kind of delved into. How this isolation and confusion and how poor communication can often alienate and kind of further separate people from each other, which ultimately leads to the eventual loneliness that Eleanor Rigby kind of warns us about. So it's also one of the few songs that by the Beatles that is in some way inspired by the experiences they had while going through LSD trips. So it's not entirely psychedelic, it is still in some way kind of inspired by their acid trips, or just kind of what they were feeling through said trips. So while I don't exactly condone drugs or any of that kind, it's still interesting how you can still take some inspiration from even the most weirdest and strangest of places, and it just goes to show that these kind of things turn up where you may least expect them. This is still another very relatable song overall. Next is the penultimate song, Got to Get You Into My Life. Another song written by McCartney himself. This one is very clearly inspired by the ongoing Motown music style that was very big and popular at the time, with acts such as, say, Stevie Wonder and the Supremes. And the lyrics themselves seem to be kind of a double meaning to it. At first glance, it seems to be just another love song about how the singer himself wants to be in a committed relationship with a particular person or woman that he's directing the song to. However, Paul himself said it in his words, it's an ode to pot. As in, he's kind of personifying and manifesting marijuana or cannabis itself as a particular person of desire, as how he wants her or it into his life, and it makes him feel good, of course, further building upon the kind of double entendres and innuendos established by the Dr. Roberts song, among a few others. But even if you were to set aside the whole pop references and all, it's still a very catchy, very fun, very upbeat song, very much like Good Day Sunshine and Yellow Submarine. And the brass themselves were performed by a group called the Blue Flames, which I gotta say are very good and very talented and impressive, which I must say. In terms of the brass themselves, to capture the sounds they desired, they had to put the microphones directly in the bells of the brass instruments and limit the very signals when they were being recorded. Then once they've all been recorded, they kind of played it back on tape and kind of just superimpose a very slight, very subtle delay, thus kind of creating a bit of a interesting kind of overdub, almost kind of giving off a very brighter, very grander sound to the brass, which is still very nifty and very creative how they managed to accomplish this kind of sound even back in 1966. And that kind of overdubbing, I have to say, must have been done very well when Jeff kind of did his strings for early ELO albums. Overall, Got to Get You Into My Life is another classic, catchy, very unique song from the Beatles, and it's no wonder that 12 years later, Earth, Wind and Fire, an actual Motownish kind of band, would do just an equally good cover version of this song for the Sgt. Pepper movie starring the Bee Gees. And so we come to the final song of Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows. I talked a bit about this back in my review of Phil Collins' Face Value album when he did a cover version of the song, but needless to say, it seems fair that I talk about the original full on myself. And as the old saying goes, as much as I love Phil Collins' own version, as they say, sometimes you just can't beat the original. And boy, is this song something. To call it spiritual and otherworldly may as well just be an understatement. It is a beautiful and an all-around, just an out-there climax to the Revolver album, and almost kind of a taster of what would come over the last few following years of the Beatles' run. Is mostly Indian inspired, similar to Love You Too. Part of its lyrics were apparently inspired by a book that Lennon himself found, which was a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead or something. How kind of going into how we just have to kind of have to likewise open ourselves up to see things that we normally wouldn't see with our normal senses, to just feel and just see everything beyond what we see here in material reality. And the music itself definitely helps complement that. It's full of these surreal, these very strange, very abstract sound effects and weird loops and distorted and reversed bits, like a reversed Harrison guitar, even a snippet of Paul McCartney's laughter kind of weirdly sped or pitched in a weird way that it kind of sounds like the calling of a seagull or something. And the vocals of Lennon himself are kind of distorted in a way that he apparently wanted to sound like a monk singing on top of the Himalaya mountains, which is actually kind of interesting considering how for the album that would become Abbey Road, the Beatles wanted to go to Mount Everest, have a photo taken of them, and have it be the cover of the album that would be called Everest. But of course, because they couldn't get the money to actually travel all the way there, they decided to just go with the famous road crossing and call it Abbey Road. But back to Tomorrow Never Knows. The title itself was actually one of Ringo's Ringoisms, a malapropism, if you will. So basically a weird phrase that seems strange but still very unique and very something you just can't really explain, but you just kind of remember it. Another Ringoism that comes to mind is the title for the album A Hard Day's Night. And part of that may be due to Ringo's own kind of weird impediments or something. I don't know, I'm still unsure on that. But regardless, Tomorrow Never Knows is a worthy climatic ender to the song, and all around almost a perfection of psychedelic music overall. And overall, as a whole, the Revolver album is very classic, and it still holds up after about 55 years, like any Beatles album, really. It in a way, much like, along with Rubber Soul, it's kind of like the bridging transition between the classic rock and roll styles of the early 60s with like Please Please Me with the Beatles and so on, into the more experimental, more artistic, more psychedelic styles of Sgt. Pepper's, Yellow Submarine, Let It Be, and so on. And some people debate on whether or not Revolver or Sgt. Pepper is the better Beatles album or the greater album overall, but honestly, both have their merits, both have their place in history of music. And if you want to get into the Beatles music, the Revolver album is one I would definitely highly recommend. Is almost near perfect. It's ranged enough so it doesn't bore you out. There's little filler, and all in all, Revolver is an influential and a ever all around just all around timeless. Next time we go back from the 60s and back into the 80s with an even heavier album by Motorhead.